Thank you for joining us today at Kindred Church. I'm so glad we get to spend this very special time together. There is an amazing theme of light and dark that weaves its way through the Bible. And it starts all the way back in the second verse of Genesis. It says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." And then the first recorded words of God spoke are found in the very next verse. God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Then in Genesis 1, 4 through 5, this same theme continues when it measures God's reaction and declares, "God saw that the light was good." So the light was separated from the darkness. Then God called the light day and the darkness night. And when we fast forward through all the Old Testament and we get to the New Testament, John describes the coming of Jesus and echoes that same theme that we find in Genesis. John 1:1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it." And then Paul, talking about us in Ephesians 5:8, says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light because of the Lord. Live as children of the light." So how do you deal with those verses? Today we're going to be talking about Jesus, our light in the darkness. As I was thinking about today's text, I tried thinking about light and dark from the perspective of the original writers and hearers. They were far more conscious about the contrast between light and darkness than most of us are today, because their lives were governed by it much more than we are today. And it's not that we're not smart enough to understand the difference. Obviously, that's not true. We understand the idea of dark and light. It's just our daily experience just isn't as influenced by the dark and the light as they were then. For instance, what's the longest you've ever gone without electricity? Think back throughout the course of your life. What's the longest you've gone without having access to electricity of any kind? Probably the longest I've ever spent my life was 15 days in September of 1989. I was living in North Carolina. Hurricane Hugo had gone through the area, and we had to live without all those creature comforts of life. Man, I can still remember carrying 5-gallon buckets of water up the hill from the lake to flush our toilets and then to kind of shower off with. And every morning I would go fishing, which, when you are fishing because you enjoy it, it's one thing. But when you have to fish because you need food, that's a whole different thing. So every morning I would go fishing, trying to catch some bass. Every night I would set my catfish lines. In between all those things, I would go out in the day to try and help clear trees out of the road so we could have access to services and so the power company could come in and fix the power. And when it was time to go to bed, my bedroom was in the basement, and the basement had almost no windows. So going to bed at night became kind of an obstacle course because we only had one flashlight in the house, and I didn't get it. One of the first nights of this darkness, I had forgotten to fill up my bucket before dark. So around midnight, I had to stumble down our backyard hill, down to the water, to get a bucket full of water to flush my stinky toilet. And I was 14 years old, so that's quite a long time ago. But I can still remember how awful those days were. We don't appreciate the contrast between day and light nearly as much, mainly because it no longer governs us to the same extent. But to these biblical writers, light was everything. And when the world was dark, there was fear and there was danger. But when daybreak came, everything came to life. And that's how the biblical writers describe the coming of Jesus, the Christ child, into the world. This is how they portrayed the impact of Jesus' arrival and how it should impact our individual lives. It was at like the difference between dark and light. It was the difference between fear of walking into a dark room versus the confidence we have of hitting the switch before we go in. And if there's one thing that Christmas is all about, it's about the triumph of light over dark. In Isaiah chapter 9, he prophesied, "The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in the land of deep darkness, a light will shine." And then Jesus, many years later, personalized this when he said in John 8:12, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Today, I would like to share three things that the coming of the light of the world marked. The first thing that it marked is the reality of darkness. Jesus once made an interesting statement about the appeal of darkness to people who have something to hide. When he's having this conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, when you get down to verse 17, he says, "God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. There is no judgment against anyone who believes in him. But anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact: God's light came into the world, but people loved the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it, for fear their sins will be exposed." Now, as I reflect on this passage and so many others that are like it, I have a theory about sin. Now, I don't think it's anything that's going to end up in some great theologian's book anytime soon, but I like to call it the cockroach theory. Now, I don't know if you've ever lived in a place where there were cockroaches. I've been in several, but if you've ever walked into a room where there's cockroaches and you turn on the light when they're there, what do? They don't put on their little cockroach sunglasses and break out the cockroach sunscreen and go bask in the orb of glowing light above them like we do. No, they try to escape it. They try to escape that light as quickly as they can. They dart all over the place as quickly as their little legs can carry them. They try to get back to the darkness as fast as they can. And my theory is that sin responds to light just like a cockroach does. People living in the darkest places will often make a furious attempt to get back under the cover of darkness when somebody hits the lights, just like cockroaches do. When was the last time you saw a brightly lit bar or nightclub? Why is it so dark in those kinds of places? Are they environmentally conscious, just trying to conserve electricity? Or is there something about sin and darkness that just goes hand in hand? Jesus says people loved the darkness. Why? Because their deeds were evil. So I don't know how profound I am philosophically or theologically, but I think sin is a lot like a cockroach. Sin hates having a light shining on it. And people who are living in sin, people who are profiting off of sin. People who are promoting an agenda of sin will fight like mad to preserve the darkness if things start to get too bright. And you can interpret that however you want. Why? Because they hate the light. And they'll do everything they can to reclaim the darkness. So the first thing that the coming of light marked in our world was the reality of just how dark our world really is. But when Jesus entered our existence, people could no longer keep their sins safely hidden under this cloak of darkness. In that same passage, Jesus said, "But those who do what is right come to the light so that others can see that they're doing what God wants." You know, we often use this word judgment in a very negative context. And from a human perspective, you know, when humans are being judgmental, then it usually is a pretty negative context. But what Jesus explains is that from God's perspective, that when this light shines, it exposes not just all the sinfulness and the ugliness, but it also exposes the good, the righteous, and the pure. Light illuminates everything, good and evil, righteousness and wickedness. The second thing to note that the coming of the light marked is the dawn of salvation. The prophet Isaiah joyfully proclaimed in Isaiah 60, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." And then in 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says, "The same God who said, 'Let there be light,' in the darkness, has made this light shine in our hearts so that we could know the glory that God is seen in the face of Jesus Christ." So a wonderful thing happened when Jesus entered our world, something that totally revolutionized our relationship with God occurred in that moment. Not too long ago, someone asked me, if knowing Jesus gives us access to heaven, how did all the people get to heaven before Jesus? What happened to all those people who lived and died before Christ? Was there any way for them to get to heaven then? Well, there was a way to get to heaven, but it wasn't salvation like we know it. It wasn't very good or enjoyable or pleasant in any way, but there was a way for people to know God. And there's multiple ways for people to know God. But in the biblical context, it was salvation through the law or through rule following. The first set of laws led to salvation that was called the Noahide Peace Treaty. I don't know if you've heard that word before, but these are all concepts you're probably pretty familiar with. Do not worship idols. Do not curse God. Do not commit murder. Do not commit adultery or sexual immorality. Do not steal. Do not eat flesh torn from a living animal. And establish courts of justice. And if you could perfectly follow these rules, then you were able to have fellowship with God. But because these rules did nothing to change people's hearts, a new covenant was formed. The law of Moses gives us 10 commandments. And if we could follow and abide by these laws, then if we couldn't do it, there were all these sacrifices that were now introduced that could be offered. Now, why were people offer these sacrifices? Was it because God loved the smell of death and burning flesh? No. God wanted people to understand the awfulness of their sins and just how deplorable those sins were to the Lord. And this is the time frame that that Isaiah was writing in. There was only strict observance of the law. That was the only thing that worked in their opinion. And the only way to receive forgiveness for my sins was to offer the required animal sacrifice according to the law. But it wasn't, for being honest, it just wasn't a very fulfilling way to know God. It was the kind of faith that gave, it wasn't the kind of faith that gave people that warm, fuzzy feeling. The Old Testament faith and ritual, it left a lot to be desired. And to be honest, there wasn't that intimacy of having a personal relationship with God that is offered to us today. But it worked for the people who lived then. And it produced some people with an incredible faith in God, people who did have a beautiful and saving relationship with Yahweh. But there's only so much joy that can be found in salvation through the law. God sent their light into the world to give us something that was far superior to what even Abraham and Moses and David and Elijah and Isaiah enjoyed. He gave us salvation through grace. And it involved forgiveness by faith. We no longer have to try to save ourselves by strictly following a bunch of rules. Now, we now understand God's forgiveness in a more complete way. It's not solely dependent on offering the right animal at the correct place or on a specific day of the year. Now we can't just discard all the rules, but we must stop thinking about the Bible as a rule book that brings salvation, and instead think about it as a book about the ruler of the universe who wanted to have a genuine connection with each and every one of us. Moreover, we're freed from the need to sacrifice a cute little lamb on an altar because the perfect lamb, the Lamb of God, shed his blood on the cross for everyone, for all time. And with the arrival of Christ, a remarkable transformation occurred in how we connect with and please God. God changed the entire plan of salvation to show us a new approach. And that new method was Ephesians 2:8. God saved you by grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a free gift from God. I'm going to say it one more time. This is the new method. This is what God introduced rather than all the sacrificial laws. God saved you by grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It was a free gift from God. The coming of light into the world marked the dawn of salvation. A third truth that we can glean from this theme of light and darkness is that the coming of the light marked the arrival of a person. The light that is shining in the darkness, that light is Jesus. Jesus was the Word made flesh. And then that flesh, that person, lived among us. The angel told Joseph in Matthew 21, she, talking about Mary, will have a son, and you, Joseph, are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now, many times, many names have been given to Jesus by prophets of old. You can go through the Old Testament and find all kinds of names that they were told this Messiah would be. Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Lion of Judah, the Messiah, Cornerstone, the Horn of Salvation, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Lamb of God, Son of Man, Son of David, Son of God, God with us, Emmanuel. And those are just a few of the names given to Christ in all these Old Testament prophecies. But the one that is still the best, there's just something about the personal name that is so much better than all the rest. All the others, they describe something about who he is And all those names are true and they're wonderful. They reveal something wonderful about him. They even bring glory to who Jesus is. But there's something about the name Jesus. Knowing his personal name means that we can really know him. All the Old Testament prophecies tell us all the formal titles of Christ. But in the New Testament, when the New Testament happens, it's kind of like God is saying, yeah, all that's true, but you can call me Jesus. At the moment of Christ's birth, God ceased to be a concept and became a very concrete presence in our lives. At Christmas, we remember that God was no longer God up there, but is now God with us. The coming of light marked the arrival of a person, and that person's name was Jesus. And that person's purpose was to seek and save that what was lost. That person desired for us to know him personally, intimately, and eternally. Why? So that we can have a very real relationship with God. And so we could be a light in someone else's life. We were given light so that we could be a light in our community. So how can you illuminate the lives of those around you? Isaiah 9:2, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine. That was the promise. John 8, Jesus explains, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. That's the fulfillment. The promise was in Isaiah. The fulfillment we see happening in John 8. Jesus is our light in the darkness. And I hope you can experience that light today. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll talk to you again next week.